Good day, economic students, and welcome to another video installment of Economic Learning Online. The particular focus of this video is monopolistic competition. So what are the objectives of our study of monopolistic competition? We already covered the characteristics of monopolistic competition when we introduced the four market models, but it's important to reassert the characteristics, so we will review the characteristics of an industry labeled monopolistically competitive, monopolistic competition characteristics. Second thing we'll do is we'll compare and contrast monopolistic competition to pure competition and monopoly, and we'll do this from the standpoint of short run cost structure, and we would say profit analysis, decision making on output and what we'd expect on profitability, both from the standpoint of pure competition and monopoly. And we'll explain why we're doing that in more detail. Then we'll talk about why we would expect monopolistically competitive firms to earn only a normal profit in the long run. So we'll talk about something we discussed earlier when we talked about the difference between economic profit and accounting profit. And we'll talk about zero economic profit being normal profit in the long run. Then we'll talk about something that everyone loves to hate, advertising. All right, so we'll talk about the pros and cons, ups and downs, positives and negatives of advertising as it relates to monopolistically competitive industries. Let's review the characteristics of an industry labeled monopolistic competition in more detail. First idea is that there are a large number of firms. So when you look at the term monopolistic competition, it's sort of a combination of pure competition and monopoly. Monopolistic competition resembles pure competition because there are a large number of firms. If you remember our study of pure competition, we assume that there's a very large number of producers. Similar situation here where there's a very large number of firms. Large number of firms, and this is also important that the firms control independently only a small market share each. So each producer, each firm, each business only controls a small market share. So you have to be careful when you say, okay, there's a large number of firms, could it be monopolistic competition? Well, if you look at something like business software, SAP and Oracle are the two giant players in that industry, multi-billion-dollar corporations, but there are literally thousands of companies that provide business software. So if you look at the entire industry, two companies control, say, 70% of the industry, right? We wouldn't label that particular industry as monopolistic competition. Something where each firm, if there's 300 firms, no one firm controls, say, more than 3% of the market share, that would be monopolistic competition. So large number of firms, large number of producers, and each firm only controls a small percentage of the market share. Next idea is no collusion, and it kind of goes in conjunction with the third idea up there, independent action. We're going to study oligopoly. An oligopoly is an industry where there are just a few players, 2, 4, 8, 10 producers. In an oligopoly, when firms make decisions such as advertising or pricing, they will consider how their competitors will react to their decisions. There will also be incentive, if you have an industry where there are only 4 or 6 firms, for the existing producers to collude, that is to say, to get together explicitly or to tacitly somehow, we'll say, control price. It could be a wink, wink, nod, nod tacit agreement where firms come to some understanding on where they want to target the price for the product or service that they're selling, or it could be an explicit situation such as OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, where they will just announce that they're going to cut production to raise price. No such behavior exists in monopolistic competition. Why? Because you have a very large number of firms. Right? they control a very tiny percentage of the market share. So it would be nearly impossible for them to collude, to get together and decide on, all right, we're all 1,000 of us going to set price according to this particular pricing model, right? So they all act independently. Now, we're going to see this when we look at the cost structure, that each firm, each producer has some control over price. So when you look at, again, the term monopolistic competition, in pure competition, each firm was a price taker, is a price taker. In monopolistic competition, the single seller, the producer, the one firm, they don't have to just settle for the market price. They have limited control over price. We will highlight this because it becomes one of the key economic features of a monopolistically competitive industry. So we're going to look at this graphically, and we'll review pure competition, we'll review monopoly, and then we'll talk about the combination approach, monopolistic competition. Now, another idea that's one of the key characteristics of monopolistic competition is the idea that producers are selling differentiated products or services. They try to somehow convince customers that their offerings are superior or better to competitors. Now, this could be something specific to the product. It could be the highest quality. It could be the lowest cost. It could be something to do with the service. In other words, we have superior service than our competitors. If you think about a place like Neiman Marcus might have personal shopping service available for their high-end customers. Well, you wouldn't expect that type of same service if you went into your Target or Walmart, right? But Target and Walmart will highlight the fact that they have price matching. So if you find something for sale at their store and you can prove that it's available somewhere else at a lower price, that they have this service where they will automatically match prices. So again, key characteristic here is differentiated products or services somehow, and highlighting the service that each company offers. Location, right? Some companies try to be the most convenient of all locations, right? You can think of, in your own life, sometimes when you think, all right, I could either drive to the supermarket to pick up a gallon of milk at a lower price, or I could stop at the convenience store a block down the road, save time, save gas, save energy. Right? The location convenience offers some type of differentiated product, in this case, differentiated service. Right? We'll also talk about branding and packaging and how that's used, and again, we're going to talk in the next slide about advertising. So, similar to pure competition, another key characteristic of monopolistically competitive industry, an industry labeled monopolistic competition, is easy entrance, easy exit from the market. Right. So if you think about a restaurant industry, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment, but one firm who wants to enter that industry simply needs to rent space or acquire a building, get the licenses necessary in that municipality, right? Make sure they have all of their ducks in a pond when it comes to making sure that they live up to the standards of that, the town, the city, the municipality in which they live, right? And they can just start offering food for sale. Now, another key characteristic of monopolistic competition is this idea of advertising, non-price competition. Because the products are differentiated, firms will want to somehow highlight which product or service aspects or qualities of their offerings are somehow superior to their competitors. So there's a high degree of advertising. Now, monopolistic competition, food services is probably one of the best examples. Think about all of the different choices individuals have when it comes to dining, right? You can go to a upscale restaurant, you can go to more of a bar type restaurant, which is more laid back. You can go to a food truck. You could get food from exclusively a takeout restaurant. There are restaurants that offer specific types of cuisine, whether it's Chinese or Italiano or sushi or Americano or Middle Eastern. So monopolistic competition industries, there's a large number of firms. They're each selling a similar product or service. They try to differentiate their product based on somehow the quality, the attributes of their product, and they have some control, but not a high degree of control over price. Easy entrance and exit into the industry, and then advertising. At the end of this presentation, we'll talk about the pros and cons and benefits and cost of advertising. All right, similar to the situation we covered when we analyzed pure competition and monopoly, we will look at how a firm operating in an industry which is labeled monopolistic competition experiences demand. So the firm's demand curve. Now, if you remember, in a market labeled pure competition, a single firm experienced demand as perfectly elastic. Each firm's a price taker. Of course, that was not the case in monopoly. Monopoly faces your traditional downward sloping demand curve. We're going to see graphically by reviewing pure competition and then monopoly and then bringing it together with monopolistic competition how the demand curve for the firm operating in a monopolistically competitive industry is a combination of both types of industry, pure competition and monopoly. Then we'll talk about, in this short run, a firm operating in an industry which is monopolistic competition could earn short-run profits, could suffer short-run losses. And then we will discuss in some detail what economists would expect to happen in the long run in an industry where there are a large number of firms. Each firm controls only a small market share. There's no collusion available for price setting. Each firm acts independently. Each firm tries to differentiate its product based on some of the attributes. There's easy entry and exit into the market, and there's a high degree of advertising. What we're going to expect is that each firm, one seller, each producer, each business earns what economists refer to as only a normal profit in the long run. Remember, the long run is the period of time in which all resources are variable, including the size of the firm, including the capital resource. So firms have the opportunity to enter or exit the industry. When businesses are making economic profit, or when economic profits are available, businesses will enter, new participants will enter the industry. If a firm or a group of firms continues to suffer losses, they will leave the industry. Now, one of the interesting aspects of covering and discussing and investigating monopolistic competition is the sort of complications that arise. We call this the trade-off between more choices, because there are so many firms in the industry offering differentiated products, versus achieving the same level of efficiency that we would expect in pure competition. So one of the interesting aspects of analyzing the long run aspect of monopolistic competition is this trade-off between a lack of or less than perfect efficiency and increased product variety. And we'll see this graphically towards the end of this presentation. So part of this lesson on monopolistic competition is comparing and contrasting an industry labeled monopolistic competition to the ideal model, that is pure competition, and also discussing how monopolistic competition somewhat resembles pure monopoly. So first let's talk about monopolistic competition and pure competition and how those two industries compare. Let's review information, ideas, economic content we already covered but is important to our discussion. On the right hand side we have a purely competitive market. So let's assume this is the market for rice. That's the right hand side. It says market. This is the rice market. The upward sloping red supply curve, think of that as 5,000 rice farmers. All right, those are the producers, the sellers, the firms in this industry. They're each selling the exact same standardized homogeneous product. All right, so this is why it's a purely competitive industry. Large number of producers selling a standardized product. No need to advertise, right? That's 5,000 rice farmers. The downward sloping demand curve obviously represents the millions of people who purchase rice, right? Whether they be firms, businesses buying rice or individuals buying rice, you get the idea, right? Millions of buyers. All right, the invisible hand, the rationing function of prices, as if led by the market forces, brings us to equilibrium, right? Equilibrium is determined by the natural forces of the market. Let's assume right now, today, the price of rice is $3 per bushel as determined by the market. On the left-hand side, we have the picture of a single firm competing in a purely competitive industry. So that is the reason why price equals marginal revenue equals demand. The black demand curve, also the marginal revenue curve, also price as experienced by the single seller competing in a purely competitive market, is perfectly elastic at the market price. So this is review. You should remember this. The price was determined by the market on the right, the large number of buyers and sellers. But if you're analyzing one producer and how that producer experiences his price, because that producer's contribution to total market output is negligible, hardly anything, they're a price taker at the market price. So keep this in mind when we compare the perfectly elastic demand curve faced by a firm in a purely competitive market to the one we're going to discuss when we evaluate monopolistic competition. So, should this firm produce? Well, remember, whether we're evaluating pure competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, or oligopoly, a firm should produce in the short run as long as it is going to make an economic profit or suffer a loss less than its fixed cost. So we're going to assume that this firm should produce. All right. Well, what level of output should they produce? The MR equals MC rule, again, applies to all four market models. This firm, the single producer, the single farm, should produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's at QF level of output. We see our white dot in this particular graph there, denoting where MR equals MC. All right. Now, in a purely competitive industry, price will always equal marginal cost because price equals marginal revenue equals demand. But in the long run, we also believe that price equals minimum average total cost. Why? Because we covered this idea that if there's economic profits to be had in a purely competitive industry, new firms will enter that market and the supply will shift to the right, the price will drop. If firms are suffering a loss, the supply curve will shift to the left and price will rise. Dynamic adjustments within the market over the long term suggest that in the long run, not only will price equal marginal cost, price will equal minimum average total cost, with each firm earning just normal profit. That means that the total revenue earned by the firm covers land, capital, labor, and just enough additional revenue to pay the entrepreneur for their time, talents, and energies. Right? Now, why is this important? This is a picture of perfect efficiency when we look at price equals marginal revenue equals minimum average total cost. Well, first it says here price equals minimum average total cost leads to productive efficiency. A single firm operating in a purely competitive market must adopt the least cost method of production. They're in constant competition with their competitors. They're price takers, so they're going to watch costs. They're going to always seek out the least cost method of production to maximize profits. So the beauty of a purely competitive market is that the market system itself generates a situation where society achieves productive efficiency in this industry. Each firm adopting the least cost method of production, price equals minimum average total cost. That's productive efficiency, using the least number of resources necessary to produce a good or service. Likewise, a purely competitive industry in the long run achieves allocative efficiency, which means what? Price equals marginal cost. Okay, what's marginal cost? It's the change in cost associated with producing the next unit of output. The additional resources necessary to produce the next unit of output, the change in total cost. This firm will stop producing where MR equals MC, marginal revenue. Society is telling each firm to produce exactly QF level of outputs. Now remember, all firms in the industry face same cost structure and are operating under same assumptions. Therefore, in the long run, society achieves allocative efficiency because the producers in this industry allocate exactly the land, capital, labor, and entrepreneur ability necessary to produce the quantity that maximizes society's happiness, the mix of output that maximizes utility. If we revisit the graph on the right, we would say that in a purely competitive industry, because price equals marginal cost and price equals minimum average total cost, productive and allocative efficiency, we maximize both producer and consumer surplus. Let's compare the picture of pure competition to the monopolist. Well, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve because the monopolist is producing a product for which there are no close substitutes and there's significant demand. So the demand here represents the total market demand for this product or service. This is a single seller, and again, they're selling every product they sell at the same price, so it's a single price monopolist. The demand curve represents potential buyers in this market. This firm will decide what level of output maximizes profit in the short run, what quantity of output maximizes profit by equating MR equals MC. However, in a monopoly situation, the single seller, which controls the market through barriers to entry, control of resources, economies of scale, right? A patent, some other, a barrier to entry, can charge a price above what would be the competitive price. This is the economic market power of the monopolist. So you see that firm chooses to produce where MR equals MC, in this case at 5 units of outputs. However, it can raise price above that point, the white point, all the way up to where Q5 intersects with demand. They can charge the price of 122, right? So if we look and say, okay, this firm's average total cost per unit, this monopolist's average total cost per unit at this level of output is 94. They're charging a price of 122. So total revenue would be 5 times 122. Right? Total cost would be 5 times 94. Right? We look at the rectangle, the lime green rectangle. That represents economic profit for the monopolist. Now, in the long run, we believe that the monopolist can continue to enjoy economic profit. Why? Because there's not going to be that dynamic adjustment that occurs in a purely competitive industry where new firms enter the industry, right? Barriers to entry prevent the new firms from competing with the monopolists. So therefore, the monopolist can charge a price above what would be the competitive price. And monopolist restricts output to maximize profitability. So in a monopoly situation, we're not achieving either allocative efficiency or productive efficiency. Price is above marginal costs, and price is above average total cost. So we're not achieving either allocative efficiency or productive efficiency. Restricting output means that society would rather have more resources allocated to the production of this product or service. And the idea that price is occurring above average total cost means that in many ways a monopoly situation does not achieve productive efficiency. Now let's look at monopolistic competition. This is the structure of a firm operating in a monopolistically competitive industry. Now, the first thing you want to do is evaluate the shape of the demand curve. Demand for a single seller in a purely competitive market is perfectly elastic. Demand for the monopolist, downward sloping and much steeper than the demand curve on this particular graph. So if you first say, okay, let's look at the name, monopolistic competition. There is some competition. There's a large number of producers in a monopolistically competitive industry, right? There's a large number of producers. No producer controls a very large market share, right? But they're not selling identical standardized homogeneous products. So in some ways, the situation of a monopolistically competitive industry resembles competition in the fact that there's a large number of producers. There's also that easy entrance and exit of firms into the industry, so it's easy for new firms to compete with existing firms, or existing firms who no longer want to make a go at it to leave, right? But there's some pricing power for the monopolists because they're offering, in some ways, a unique product, right? A differentiated product. They're offering some type of quality or service or characteristics of the product or service to attract their customers away from other producers in this industry. So the demand curve is downward sloping. It's rather elastic. It's rather flat looking, right? Then we have our marginal revenue curve. Remember, marginal revenue is the change in revenue associated with selling the next unit of output. Change in total revenue is associated with selling the next unit of output. The monopolist will choose to produce where MR equals M. Sorry, the monopolistically competitive firm will choose to produce where MR equals MC. So this is one restaurant. So think of the city of Philadelphia. There's literally thousands of restaurants. This is one restaurant, right? So they'll choose to produce where MR equals MC, right? Think about, I did a search for this just out of curiosity. This is one mechanic out of the 30 mechanics within a 10-mile radius of my home, right? And there's literally 100 mechanics within a 20-mile radius. So this is a monopolistically competitive industry. So they'll produce at Q1 where MR equals MC. They'll charge price P1, and this monopolistically competitive firm is generating economic profit because price at P1 is above average total cost at Q1, right? Now, there is a possibility that monopolistically competitive firms can continue to enjoy economic profits for a time, even though there should be some adjustment in the industry with firms entering that particular market. It's possible in a monopolistically competitive industry, a monopolistic competition, for a firm to suffer short-run losses. Think about what's happening in the pandemic economy. Many small businesses are hurting. There's lots of retailers who sales are way down, right? Demand for many products and services has declined precipitously since March of 2019. Decrease in demand decreases price, right? So these producers have some control over price, not a great deal of control over price. So it's possible that price in the market has fallen below average total costs, right? So this firm would produce at Q2 where MR equals MC. Remember, the MR equals MC rule always tells the firm the profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output in the short run. The firm will always equate the additional revenue it receives from selling the next unit of output relative to the additional cost incurred for producing the next unit of output, the change in total cost associated with producing the next unit of output. MR equals MC tells the firm Q, quantity Q star to produce, in this case Q2 level of output. They will set the price where Q2 equals demand at P2. Unfortunately, P2, price 2, is below average total cost 2, so this firm is suffering a short run loss. We covered monopolistic competition and evaluated a single firm operating in an industry labeled monopolistic competition in the short run, and we determined that a single firm operating in an industry characterized by monopolistic competition could earn short-run economic profits or could suffer short-run losses. What about in the long run? This graph demonstrates the long run. What do economists expect happens in an industry labeled monopolistic competition in the long run? The period of time when firms can enter and exit an industry. So if there's economic profits persist over longer periods, new firms will enter that industry. All right, number of firms will expand, and that should push down price. If economic losses persist, firms will exit the industry. So this is the period of time when all of those adjustments have taken place. So in the long run, we would expect firms to produce at Q3. Q3 meaning what? MR equals MC, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That will always determine the firm's profit maximizing level of output. What price will they charge? So the Q3 level of output, price will be P3, right? The firm will equate demand at quantity 3 output, that dark black spot on the demand curve. They'll charge P3. Notice that this black spot point on the demand curve also intersects with average total cost. But let's compare this picture of the long run in monopolistic competition to what we would expect in pure competition and what economists desire to be, economists believe to be the paradigm of efficiency. Remember, in pure competition, price equals marginal cost, price equals minimum average total cost. When price equals marginal cost, society is achieving allocative efficiency. When price equals minimum average total cost, society is achieving productive efficiency. If we look at the long run picture of monopolistic competition, we make an important observation. Price in monopolistically competitive industry occurs slightly higher than minimum average total cost, right? P4 equates to minimum average total cost, right? But the firms operating in an industry that is monopolistic competition, they're not achieving this minimum average total cost, right? So there's a price slightly higher than minimum average total cost. So we're failing to use resources perfectly efficiently, our land, capital, and labor resources, not exactly achieving that idea of the least cost method of production at all times. We also failed to achieve allocative efficiency. Notice the difference between, or the distance between, Q3 and Q4, what we call excess capacity at minimum average total cost, right? This excess capacity. So this is the interesting aspect of evaluating the monopolistic competition industry model. It boils down to what economists like to discuss, trade-offs. So there's a tremendous trade-off here. An industry labeled monopolistic competition offers buyers, offers consumers more choice, more choices of restaurants, more choices of hotels, right? More choices of holiday destinations, right? More choices of sporting goods stores, right? More choices of retail clothing. We don't all want to live in a world where we all wear gray clothing, right? But those additional choices come at a cost. We trade some efficiency. It's a trade-off of some efficiency loss for more choices. Most economists believe that, in many ways, this is a necessary and good trade-off. Right? That it adds sort of some excitement and spice to our lives. We don't want to live in a world where everybody's doing the same thing all the time. Another interesting aspect of monopolistic competition, when you talk about what economists assume will happen as far as profits in monopolistic competition, theoretically, after the period of adjustment over the long run, when firms have the opportunity to enter the industry or exit the industry based on short-run economic profits or the persistence of economic losses, we would assume that each firm earns only normal profits. However, evidence has shown that it is quite possible for a single firm operating in an industry labeled monopolistic competition to continue to earn economic profits for long periods of time. This firm has achieved the ability to generate economic profits for a sustained period of time because they have a loyal customer base, they offer a product or a service where the attributes and the characteristics are desirable to consumers, they continue to provide that good or service in a fashion that we will say meets the needs of their customers. The other interesting aspect of monopolistic competition is that business owners sometimes are willing to accept less than economic profit for their services and their happiness. In other words, let's assume that a restaurant owner has a degree in finance, and that degree in finance could earn this man $125,000 working for some financial firm. However, the person is happy to achieve less financial income owning and operating a small restaurant, let's say $70,000, because there's something to be said about being your own boss and the captain of your own ship and not answering to someone, right? So there's definitely some of this trade-off when you look at it. You can make these observations on your own as you look around the world and you apply these economic concepts and principles. There are business owners who have decided that for them it's a healthy trade-off to accept less financial compensation to own and operate a business in which there's more emotional, maybe even intellectual reward. It also is what makes studying economics quite interesting. This concludes this video. We'll see you down the road on later videos.